On the Urban Amish Show, I want to explore stories, ideas, people, and events that point to a higher pattern or patterns. I want to draw our attention to beauty in various forms because I believe beauty beckons to us from beyond, calling us to sacrifice for something truly noble and worthy. It's easy to get cynical about the way things are in the world. Sometimes we need to be reminded to look at what's truly beautiful and let it speak to us. We seem to be caroming from one crisis to the next with breakneck speed. Is that a word, caroming? That is a word, isn't it? When I say it out loud, it sounds, maybe I'm not pronouncing it right. I'm sure someone will correct me. I don't need to tell you what's going on in the world. We've got opioids, suicide, alcohol overdose. I read today that alcohol killed more people under the age of 65 in 2020 than COVID-19 did. So, mentioning the various crises, of course, COVID-19 doesn't need to be mentioned. And now, freaking Vladimir Putin is over there trying to start World War III, while the inflationary dumpster fire is burning up our savings. We didn't even get the roaring 20s here. What's going on? I want to use this show to remind us of some of the things that are really true, good, and beautiful. Things are going to go on in the world that are going to distract us and even make us fearful and make us worry about the future. I talked last week on the podcast about what it means to be the good king of your own life, let's say, to be inspired by the archetypal good king and other good kings that we see, stories, good kings in stories, and I related Zelensky's war leadership to that of the good king, and I think that's one of the reasons why he's such a gripping figure. Our hearts yearn for the good king. We have this longing to believe that there is such a thing as a good king, or that there can be. And I think we all have a longing, especially us men, we have a longing to be the good king in our own families. You really want your kids to look up at you and look at you as the good king, right? I saw the confirmation hearings in the Senate this week for, her name's escaping me now, Catania? I forget. I'm sorry. I wasn't planning to talk about this, and I don't have it in front of me. But during those confirmation hearings, I saw a snapshot of her daughter sitting there, looking at her, and you could just tell she was admiring her. She had this big grin on her face, and she was just super proud of her mom. And no matter what you think of her mom's judicial style or record or politics or any of it, and I've paid very little attention to it yet. I want to get into that, and I want to understand more about her, and I'm working on just trying to understand what her background is and her, the way she thinks about things like critical race theory and all of that. But no matter what all that is, her daughter clearly was proud of her, and the camera just captured a pretty cool moment where she was just looking at her mom with this big proud smile on her face. And I thought, every parent wants to be looked at by their kids in that way. You want your kids at some point in their life to be able to look up at you and say, yeah, that's the good king, or that's the good queen. Wise and not overbearing and not blind to reality, and all of that. So how do we be the good king? It's one of the things we talked about last week, but I want us to think a little bit about being captured by and turning our attention to that which is true, good, and beautiful all around us, even while there's plenty that's not, right? Where we pay attention is where our energy flows. And if we're constantly paying attention to things that are stressful, fearful, and anxiety-inducing, then that's kind of what you're going to get in your life, anxiety and stress. One of the things I want the Urbanomics show to be is a way to look at what's going on in the world and talk about those things, but hopefully not in a way that are stress-inducing, or anxiety-inducing, rather. So I think that trying to find what the patterns are that are always playing out in the world, what's reality, how is reality constructed, or what are the patterns that keep repeating in reality, and how do we live lives that are peaceful and wise and loving and all of that? When we were in New York last week for spring break, we visited some family, and we got to spend some time with a church youth group that had some of my teenagers, friends that were getting together for a prayer meeting. And we spent the evening with them. The evening was led by my brother-in-law. And I want to tell you about this service. Don't go away. Don't think this is going to be boring, because it's not. I have been to a lot of lame prayer meetings, I'll be honest. I grew up going to church 3 times a week, and prayer meeting every Wednesday night. And I wasn't a fan. That's putting it mildly. Recently, our family has not been going to church, although it's an ongoing conversation with us. But anyway, we were at this prayer meeting, and I was so struck by the beauty of what was happening there that night. It's easy to get cynical about things, particularly when you've been in church your whole life and you've just seen this, the way things, you've seen real life in church, and it's not always perfect. And like I said, sometimes the prayer meetings are kind of lame. At least that's how I experienced them when I was a kid. And I experienced some lame ones when I was an adult too, but this one wasn't lame. Let me tell you what was going on. So we were sitting around this family room, I think there's 22 kids, 22 teenagers and young adults in a circle. And they had been studying, this group of young adults had been studying together for 3 months. My daughter was a part of that group, and they had been in this Bible study intensive. So they were a close-knit group, and we got to sit in with them and join them on the one Wednesday night. What we got to see there was really moving and convicting in a lot of ways, and it made me rethink some of my positions on church and the way we're currently doing church or not doing it. I'll talk more about that a little later. But this was the kind of prayer meeting that, I'll just describe it and then I'll let you decide. But they went around and they would one of the young people would sit in a chair that was kind of the designated chair for the prayee, the people were going to pray for this person. And the whole point of the evening was to wrap up this intensive 3-month Bible study with a prayer meeting, praying for everyone, and just kind of a farewell, wrapping things up kind of thing. But we got to watch as outsiders. We hadn't participated in this 3-month Bible study, so we kind of just got to watch. And as they went around the room and prayed for each one, I thought about it. Here's a group of 21 of their peers, all focusing their attention on the person being prayed for. And they're trying to imagine what it would look like if everything went well for this person. You could tell everybody loved everybody else. There was a lot of love in the room. And it was like, if I imagine the highest and best thing for you, and I focus my attention on God, and I talk to Him about how I want things to go for you, the highest and best way. And I'm just going to focus my attention on you and talk about that. And then go around the room and just people kind of spontaneously speaking out these blessings, encouragement, prayers, requests, visions. It's like if I do my best to imagine how it would be for you if everything went as well as it could be, and I would ask God for that, I thought about, it's hard to be cynical about that. It's actually really beautiful. There's nothing lame about that. To be surrounded by your peers who are so interested in your success and peace and blessing that they are moved to tears, speaking to God on your behalf, asking that He pour out His blessings on you. I thought, I can't be cynical about that. Not even a little bit. That went on for 4.5 hours. No one was on their phone. No one was whispering or being distracted. I'm talking about, kids. My youngest is 13. Anywhere from 13 up to probably, the bulk of the kids were from 17 to 22, probably. And then there was some parents there. We were together for 4.5 hours that night doing just what I talked about. And I thought, and it seemed like an hour. It didn't seem like a long night at all. And I thought, this is not common. This is not mundane. This is not just another Wednesday night or Thursday night prayer meeting. There's something sacred here. There's something special going on here. But then as I was chatting with the group, and then the next night as I joined them for another service, their graduation ceremony, I discovered that, no, this is actually how these people live. Like, this happens all the time for them. This kind of being surrounded by people who are so in love with God and who live in love that they are routinely that interested in being together, being together in a way that's fun and peaceful, and when the time is right, pray and be moved to tears to bless you. It's like, wow, that's really cool. And to see a community of Christ followers who, for them that's just routine, a normal part of their life. And I thought that it would be hard to turn that down if that was in your life. I'll say that. And my son Ben and I, who was on episode 1 of the Urban Amish show, we got to talking about what would it take to create that here? Because Benjamin and Portia and William and Bridget were all sitting there and observed this same thing. And my wife MJ and I had the same conversation. How does that happen? That's wild. How are these kids sitting here for 4.5 hours doing this? It's it's pretty gripping. There's something gripping about it. I don't, some of you will know what I mean. And some of you think that sounds crazy, but yeah, so that's something beautiful that, it moved me to tears, the beauty of it. And it made me rethink some of my views on church and my own habits. And I'm just kind of, it's a conversation I want to have with you all at some point. We'll talk a little bit more about my journey with church and all that, but I'm curious where some of you are. That kind of happened to me, although my faith then got renovated and restored, but I didn't go back to church. So I'm kind of in that in-between place, I guess. But let's talk more about that later. I want to get back to looking at beautiful things like I just described, that 4.5 hour prayer meeting, and how that goodness and beauty shifted my perception of something that I'd been wrestling with. I think that's really, if we let goodness and truth and beauty shift our perception, it can open us to a new view of things, right? We can, if we're sometimes we get stuck in seeing things a certain way, and we need to have our perspective shifted. And sometimes being in a community where something kind of spontaneous comes about, or intentional, but it's something beautiful like that, where you see something so far outside of what you're accustomed to in a positive way, and you're like, wow, I want more of that. How do I get more of that in my life? Not in a striving way, but in a way where you're drawn to it. You're like, yeah, that's good. So I want to shift gears a little bit now. We're going to touch on how beauty can do that for us, and some of the ways that we can shift our perceptions. But this theme that keeps coming up on our show is that of fear, and the way that fear holds us back and keeps us from living the life that we were meant to live. There's Stephen Pressfield, who wrote The War of Art, talks about this idea. He talks about fear in a little different way. He calls it resistance. And resistance is more than just fear, but it's certainly also fear. This resistance that keeps us from living the life that we were created to live, designed to live. Keeps us from exercising the gifts we've been given. Fear of failure, fear of success, fear of what people will think. I don't know what it all is, but the one paragraph or several paragraphs that Pressfield writes about resistance really struck me, and I printed it out and put it on my wall where I see it every day, because I think it's such a striking and crystallizing reminder of how we can use fear. We talked, I think it was in episode 3, about how sometimes you can you can confront your fears and then put them behind you, face them, and then move beyond them and put them behind you. And then your fears can actually serve as a motivator towards your goal, rather than something that frightens you. Pressfield talks about resistance this way. He says, resistance is infallible. Like a magnetized needle floating on a surface of oil, resistance will unfailingly point to true north, meaning that calling or action it most wants to stop us from doing. We can use this. We can use it as a compass. We can navigate by resistance, letting it guide us to that calling or action that we must follow before all others. Rule of thumb: the more important a call or action is to our soul's evolution, the more resistance we will feel toward pursuing it. Have you found that? Have you ever noticed that? It kind of goes with this idea that we talked about in episode 3 of in striquulinus invenatur, that old Latin phrase that means in filth it will be found. What you need the most will be found where you least want to look. I discovered that so powerfully that before I read Pressfield, I actually had this sense that is how we can use our fears. We can use our fears as a navigational beacon. Is there something that you are called to do, that you know you're called to do, but it scares the crap out of you? I know what that's like. I think we always have something out there on the horizon that calls to us, beckons to us, draws us forward. And yet is this fearful, unknown future. Particularly when there's some work or creative output or art or music of some kind or writing or a relationship or something that you need to do, something, what does Pressfield say? A call or action that's important to our soul's evolution. What is that for you? Does it make you fearful when you think about moving towards that? A couple months ago, I was talking to a friend, and we started talking about a business idea, and we talked about how we could help serve people in a specific way. And I thought, that'd be scary to do that. But then I thought, you know what? Maybe if it's scary, maybe that means I should do it. That's what Pressfield is saying. Resistance is infallible in the way that it points towards where we need to go. It's a navigational beacon, points you towards your destiny. What are you most afraid of? Go do that. Life will get crazy good if you keep doing that. Not easy, but meaningful. Keep moving towards your fears, speaking the truth. You're going to move right into what you're called to. I want to catch up on what's going on in the world, shifting gears a little bit. Obviously headlines are dominated by the Russia-Ukraine thing, but have you seen this? There's a British aid worker who was detained in Iran for 6 years, separated from her daughter. And I just saw a headline that this Nazanin Ratcliffe released after 6 years detention in Iran. So this British Iranian charity worker who had been held in Iran for almost 6 years has been released and is en route back to the UK. Her daughter was only 18 months old when she was separated from her mother. Of course, Iran accused her of being a spy or some crazy thing when she was actually an aid worker. And it's just, I can't imagine what she went through, but it just made me happy to see her picture in the news as she's headed back to the UK to be reunited with her husband and with her daughter. So good news. Bad news. Did you see this? Ethiopia pledges action after video shows uniformed men. I almost can't. Burning civilians alive. I'll read the first paragraph here. Ethiopia's government said on Saturday it would act against the perpetrators after a video appeared on social media showing armed men, some in military uniforms, burning civilians to death in the country's west. A horrific and inhumane act was recently committed. In a series of horrific images circulated on social media, innocent civilians were burned to death, said the Ethiopia Government Communication Service in a statement on its Facebook page. I cannot imagine what must be going on in people's lives that they would engage in this kind of violence. There's been a lot of violence in Ethiopia for the last few years, but this is not. It says this is separate from the ethnic violence in the Tigray region that erupted in November of 2020. So this is something different going on. But pray for the people in Ethiopia. Obviously, it's easy to put all of our attention on the terrible, terrible things that are happening in Ukraine, but obviously pain is not limited to Ukraine. So pray for Ethiopia. Sorry to see that. That's a dark, something pretty dark for sure. Interesting things happening in the world politics, and I want to kind of talk about second level down stuff for a little bit, because obviously, China and Russia both being allied to a certain extent, and they both have designs on smaller, more Western type of countries near their borders. Russia's trying to take Ukraine, and China wants to take Taiwan. But kind of a little bit lower level, I saw on CNN that Chile has a new president, Gabriel Boric, and the guy is like hard left, seriously hard left. I don't know when these South and Central American countries are going to realize that an ordered liberty with some type of rule of law and free markets and all of that like would really help a lot. They sometimes just take these hard left turns into socialism and all kinds of stuff. So Chile has apparently a new hard left president. He's kind of a fascinating looking dude. He's tattooed, and he doesn't like to wear suits, which is pretty unusual in Chile. Usually the politicians are pretty buttoned up. This guy has, looks like on his right arm, a completely black 2-inch band tattoo all the way around his forearm. Kind of a cool tattoo, but unusual for a Chilean president. So going to be interesting to see how that affects the politics in South America. But I hope the best for them. I hope they do not go down the path that Venezuela took. But Chile has had kind of an interesting past. There's been a military coup in 1973. So they've had a lot of kind of ups and downs, but we'll see how things turn out for them as they lurch to the left, let's say. So anyway, as speaking of right and left, I saw a study that investigated the question of, can a pandemic make people more socially conservative? They focused on political ideology, gender roles, and the case of COVID-19. So you can check this out if you Google the behavioral immune system and can a pandemic make people more socially conservative? And it gets down to that behavioral immune system. Check that out. There's obviously, you know about the immune system that fights disease and all that, but there's a behavioral immune system that affects us at a behavioral level, but it's related to disease, actually. And I'm going to read a little bit of this information about this study. So 2 mechanisms through which activation of the behavioral immune system may promote conservatism include disgust sensitivity and fear of contamination. So those 2 kind of mechanisms activate the behavioral immune system and may promote kind of a conservatism. And if you think about it evolutionarily, it actually makes sense, because you've been exposed to the people around you and whatever germs that they're carrying, you've become immune to. And if you're a tribe in the jungle, let's say, well, that's all you really need to be immune to. However, if there's someone from another tribe, someone not from your group, they're probably carrying a whole host of things that you're not immune to, and interacting with them can make you, well, it could kill you, and it could kill your whole tribe. So there's kind of a stronger in-group, out-group kind of sensitivity in those kind of settings. And when we're faced with pandemics, when we're faced with things that make us fearful of contamination or increase disgust sensitivity, which some people are more prone to than others, but those things activate this behavioral immune system and activate these ancient systems, these ancient tribal systems that make us not want to be exposed to people from the other tribe, that fear of contamination. And those are really ancient systems that are subconscious. We're not really even aware that it's happening. So I'm going to return to reading here again. A powerful adaptation that humans have evolved for avoiding disease is the capacity to feel disgusted. Yet disgust not only prevents people from ingesting contaminants and coming into contact with contagious others, but also serves to protect social and moral order by coordinating condemnation of norm violations. In this vein, the experience of feeling disgusted may physiologically spill over into one's moral judgments and promote socially conservative attitudes. The effective pathogen threat on ideology may even operate in the absence of feeling disgusted should contamination fears become salient. Simply priming people with the idea of cleanliness can make them more conservative. For example, if they see hand sanitizer or using antiseptic hand wipes, it can make them more conservative. These are all, and there's citations for all of this, and I can put this in the show notes. Accordingly, pathogen threats posed by the COVID-19 pandemic were a probable stimulus of conservatism even among individuals who themselves did not feel disgusted during the pandemic. Given that hygiene maintenance, namely hand washing, has been widely promoted as a measure to prevent COVID-19 transmission, chronically elevated fears of contamination may independently have sufficed to drive conservative attitudes via activation of the behavioral immune system with or without the recruitment of disgust. So, during the emergence of the COVID-19 pandemic, participants, this is now jumping ahead to talking about, were they shifted to a more conservative view? This is what the study was looking at. And they looked specifically to measure conservatism on baseline political ideology, and then their view of traditional gender stereotypes and gender roles shift as a result of the pandemic. And essentially, I won't read the rest of it here, but essentially they found out that there was a small but noticeable shift to be more conservative. So people across the political spectrum, liberal or conservative, reported that in a fairly small but marked shift, they preferred more traditional gender roles and more traditional gender stereotypes after the pandemic, after they'd been through the pandemic. And it's important for us to think about this because we've just gone through a global pandemic, and if over the next generation, if those ancient systems of the behavioral immune system come on, like they've activated these, this kind of little shift to the right, let's say, in some of us, and well, no, not in some of us, in all of us at some level, as we've experienced this pandemic, that's going to have implications for politics over the next generation. No question. How much does it lurch to the right? I don't know. I grew up pretty conservative. Like, I was a right-wing Republican young man, and, I'm a libertarian now. But it's interesting to think about what could happen if things shift to the right significantly. And depending on what your baseline political ideology is, you have different ways that you feel about that. But it's important for us to realize that that's likely to happen on a global level, and there's no way to predict how that might manifest itself, but to think about that it will is important. It's important because what you see happening in Russia right now is Putin critiquing the West, critiquing their loss of morals, traditional morals, their loss of traditional gender roles and stereotypes, and other ways that he critiques the West. And he really sees Russia as a potential superpower to balance out the immoral West with a more Christian, Orthodox, righteous people. That's his goal with strengthening Russia. He's really, it's a strange hybrid of church and state over there, and it has been for over 1,000 years. Putin is deeply connected to the Russian Orthodox Church and the highest leader of the Russian Orthodox Church is one of his closest allies, one of his closest advisors, and is behind him on this, or supports the war in Ukraine. That approach to conservatism and using military power to enforce that worldview and try to dominate in that way, obviously that's the way, through Putin's lens, that's the right thing to do. Obviously he's a pariah now, but it is interesting to think about what would happen if there are other people, other leaders on the world stage who may be kind of trending that way, that kind of, have some of those tendencies, but over, a period of time, we shift to the right a little bit more. Does that activate these kind of autocratic or authoritarian tendencies? Are we going to see more Putins rise up? Is that, I think I don't know. It's important for us to think about, because the global pandemic is absolutely going to have implications for behavioral immune system type, or changes in our worldviews over time that were activated by these things like disgust sensitivity and all that. So let's keep an eye on that. From The Spectator, an interesting question about, would you fight? Looking at Ukraine, you see people fighting to defend their motherland, mostly men staying behind, a lot of women and children going to safety if they can, millions of them displaced, homes destroyed. But for many of us watching from the West, it's fascinating, and I find myself kind of thinking, what would I do? Like, if the Russians were outside our town and shelling us, what would I do? Where would I have, who would I team up with? Obviously, you'd want to try to push them back. But the decision to stay and fight versus get to safety is a decision that Zelensky made. And it's inspired, I think, President Zelensky staying in Kiev and fighting has been a critical part of getting people behind him and getting his country, really getting them activated in a way that are helping them, hold Russia at bay, despite Russia's immense military advantage. The Spectator says, for many of us war voyeurs watching the news with a glass of sherry, admiration of the little engine that could, Ukrainian fighters, is underwritten by unease. As families escape to safety, plenty of feisty Ukrainians are remaining behind to battle a far more powerful aggressor, and they're not all men either. The question nags then, in the same circumstances, would we stick around to defend our homelands, or would we cut our losses and get out? What would you do? Let me know. I really do want to know. Let's talk about it. There are things worth fighting for. Barry Weiss writes on her Substack, it feels like we are living through President Volodymyr Zelensky's moment in history. Kiev is being shelled and has been for the past 3 weeks, but the former comedian remains at his desk wearing his army t-shirt and sitting in his green leather chair on Bankova Street in the center of the city. More than 2 million Ukrainians have fled the country, but he will not budge. The fight is here, he said, responding to an offer from the Americans to help him evacuate, and then, reportedly, I need ammunition, not a ride. I'm in Florida right now, and I saw a guy wearing a t-shirt with the line printed yellow and blue. Already, there are t-shirts, says Barry Weiss. And she continues, there is a reason that line, apocryphal or not, instantly became a meme. It is because we live in an era which acting like sheep has become the norm, in which cowardice is the default, in which the ideas of leadership and sacrifice seemed like dead letters. And yet, here was the real article, a leader showing courage, real courage, and in doing so, inspiring bravery in others that they did not think themselves capable of. Duty, responsibility, moral clarity. He is breathing life into virtues many Americans thought were on life support or already dead. Zelensky knows what he's fighting for. We are all at war, he said in an address to Ukraine. Everywhere people defend themselves, although they do not have weapons, but these are our people. They have courage, dignity, and hence the ability to go out and say, I'm here, it's mine, and I won't give it away. My city, my community, my Ukraine. And he knows what he is willing to do to get it. In his speech last week to British Parliament, he said it through the words of Churchill. We will fight till the end, at sea, in the air. We will fight in the forests, in the fields, on the shores, in the streets. He promised to never surrender. My favorite Zelensky line of all, though, the most profound thing of many profound things in these shocking weeks, came when a reporter asked him how he was doing given the circumstances. Here's what he said. My life today is wonderful. I believe that I am needed. That's the most important sense of life, that you are needed, that you are not just an emptiness that breathes and walks and eats something. That is the truth. And I can see it, and I'm pausing my read of Barry Weiss here to comment on this. People don't want what's easy. We want what's meaningful. We want to find the thing in our life that we were called to do. We want to find the thing that we were created to do, that only we can do, the role that only we can fill. And when we find that, it's unbelievably meaningful. Even if it's a freaking war. Even if the shells are falling all around us and there's 3 or 4 assassin squads constantly out looking for you, trying to kill you. What does he say? It's the best time of his life. My life today is wonderful. I believe that I am needed. That's the most important sense of life, that you are needed, that you are not just an emptiness that breathes and walks and eats something. Come on. That's good, isn't it? How do you find that thing for you? You face your fears. Remember what we talked about? Resistance is infallible. Always points to where you need to go. Returning to Barry Weiss's brilliant Substack. Cynics will point out that Zelensky is an actor, adept at delivering lines, even at playing a president. They'll say that he knows how to tug at our heartstrings, and he is doing it purposefully to draw the West into the war and get Ukraine the help it needs. Maybe. Probably. But this isn't a movie. His life really is on the line, and that explanation, in any case, does not account for the millions of ordinary Ukrainians who are taking up arms to defend their land. In one video, I watched a computer programmer waiting in line to get his weapon in Kiev to fight the Russian invaders. Their objective clearly seems to be the occupation of my entire country and the destruction of everything that I love. I'm just a regular civilian. I have nothing to do with war or any other thing like it. And I wouldn't really want to participate in anything like this, but I don't really have a choice. This is my home. In another, I watched a choir in Odessa sing. I came to find out that the name of the song they were singing is called Choir of Hebrew Slaves from the opera Nabucco. It recalls the tragedy of the destruction of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem at the hands of the Babylonians. Oh, my homeland, so beautiful and lost. Listening to such people speak and sing so plainly is deeply moving and inspiring. It is also, if I'm honest, unsettling. Why? Why is witnessing such courage uncomfortable? It is because I cannot help but notice the gap between them and us, between the bigness of their vision and their mission and the smallness of ours, between their moral clarity and our moral confusion, between their spine and our spinelessness, between their courage and our epidemic of cowardice, between their commitment to civilization and our resignation to chaos. Watching Zelensky and his people reminds me of what we have lost, of how uncertain and fragile we have become. That's right, it does me too. Go check out the rest of Barry Weiss's Substack. It's brilliant. Reminds me of what we have lost, but it can be recovered. We all have a life that is waiting for us, that we can say of it that we are needed, that we are precisely where we are most needed, and life will be seriously meaningful as we're in that. Did you see what Putin said the other day when he was talking about this? What does he call it? He doesn't call it a war. Special military. I forget what he calls it. some strange little line that he has. It's actually illegal in Russia now to call it a war. I think you face 10 or 20 years in prison for calling it a war. But as Putin was talking about going to Ukraine, his story is, of course, that they're liberating the Ukrainians from Nazis. Sounds familiar. In some ways, it's like he did the same thing with Chechnya, similar tactics, when he went into Chechnya and took that over. He casts himself as the heroic rescuer when he's actually the aggressor. He was talking about the Russian sons and daughters who are being sent to war, mostly sons. It's Russia, after all. He talks about the Russian sons being sent off to war, and he quotes the Gospel of John. He misquotes the Gospel of John. There is no other love rather than if someone gives soul for their friends. Let me read from calcatholic.com. At a rally in Moscow on Friday, Russian President Vladimir Putin paraphrased John 15:13 to justify the ongoing invasion of Ukraine, which has killed hundreds of civilians, including dozens of children. During his speech at the rally held in Moscow's Luzinsky Stadium to celebrate the 8th anniversary of Crimea's annexation, which is not recognized by most countries, Putin lauded the Russian military for heroically fighting in Ukraine. You know, I remember the words from the Bible, there is no other love rather than if someone gives soul for their friends, Putin said, according to the broadcast of his speech. The remark was followed by huge applause from the crowd. Putin's remark was a reference to John 15:13, which states, "Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends." We are seeing the heroic deeds of our guys in this operation, Putin added. These words from the Holy Scripture of Christianity, it's something that is very dear to those who profess this religion. But everything is down to the facts that this universal value for all the peoples and all the confessions of Russia, and for own people above all, and the best confirmation of that is how our guys are fighting in the course of this military operation, shoulder to shoulder, helping and supporting each other, he continued. If the need comes, they will shield each other on the battlefield from the bullets as brothers. We have not had such unity for a long time. During Putin's speech, Russia 24, the state-owned media outlet broadcasting the address, switched to the footage of a military band playing on the same stage, the Moscow Times reported. The independent news outlet noted that Russia state television is tightly controlled and such interruptions are highly unusual. However, the Kremlin later claimed the broadcast was interrupted due to technical problems on the server. While the RIA Novosti news agency reported over 95,000 in attendance and over 100,000 outside the stadium, the newspaper cited reports of some people being forced to attend the rally. They stuck us in a bus and drove us here, one woman was quoted as telling the Sota news outlet outside the stadium. Some reports in Russia media also suggested that people were offered 500 rubles to attend the event. If you have read any Russian literature, Russian novels, and Russian books, you know that being forced to attend political rallies is a long-standing tradition in Russia. So I suspect that these 195,000 in attendance when Putin quoted the Gospel of John, I suspect that they weren't there of their own volition, at least not for the most part. But it's mind-blowing to just sit in the tension of knowing what Putin's doing, dropping bombs into Ukraine, just indiscriminately killing men, women, and children. He wants this land. He wants to take this land back and exercise power over it. He doesn't care that they don't want to be ruled by him. He believes that he has the right to take that. And to justify that, he's talking about greater love has no man than if someone gives their life for their friends. And he's talking about his own soldiers who are aggressing on Ukraine. What a twisted, demented lie. It makes me angry when I think about the way that he twists the gospel of peace while he's at war. It also reinforces the point that this is a deep, deep conflict that is deeper than just what the current politics of the day would say. There's been a long, long-standing tradition of Russia playing this unpredictable foil to the West, and Putin has been focused on trying to put Russia back together. He's not trying to put the Soviet Union back together from what I can read. He's really trying to go back to the great mother Russia, back to the time of the czars in some sense, and restore Russian glory on the world stage. Russia has this deep pain and comes from the place that they've occupied on the world stage over the last 100 years or so. And they feel it's important for them to feel like victors, like respected victors. And Putin, I think, feels that so deeply. He wants to exercise power and bring Russia back up to this respected place on the world stage. And the problem with a guy like Putin is because of his authoritarian leadership style, he doesn't want anybody around him who's too threatening, right? Because that's the way that dictatorships work. Is you can't have anybody. You want to make sure that if you're having a bad day, that two of your guys don't gang up on you and take you out. Because if you're leading just by raw power, well, you can get taken out by some of your underlings if they're if they have too much initiative. So what happens over time in a dictatorship is they kind of hollow out. The leadership structure hollows out, and nobody's willing to or able to speak the truth to power because he won't allow anyone around him to speak the truth. He's got this vision that is total and complete, and he's just going to act on it. If anybody gets in his way, he just has them arrested or killed. So to hear him claim this, gospel truth as he's pounding the crap out of Ukraine, it just was such a strange, twisted mirror image in some upside down mirror image in some. I just thought it was fascinating, and how it points again to how much of a spiritual quest this is for Putin too. And actually, that's something that Tim Costello wrote about in The Guardian. I'll read a little bit of this. I just wanted to point you towards this. The Russian president's Orthodox faith is central to his worldview, but he has used it to justify invasion and violence in God's name. I'm going to read just a little excerpt from this article. I'm not going to read the whole thing. The spiritual space is an important clue often overlooked. In 988, Vladimir, king of the Rus, was the first Christian convert. In Kiev, he summoned the whole city to the banks of the Dnieper River for a mass baptism. Holy Mother Russia was born. In 2019, the Ukrainian church broke with the Russian church and declared its independence. But Putin and the Russian church will not accept this because it is the site of the imagined mother church for all of the Rus. Putin. We see many of the Euro-Atlantic countries are actually rejecting their roots, including the Christian values that constitute the basis of Western civilization. They are denying the moral principles and all traditional identities, national, cultural, religious, and even sexual. Kiev must be taken in his mind to preserve the Christian battle, and there may be many Christians in the West who agree with some of his sentiments. A miracle defender of Christianity or the most evil man? Well, it is Ukrainian Christians, among others, whom he is now slaughtering indiscriminately, and he has little understanding of Jesus, who said, "Blessed are the peacemakers." No, this is a power vision threaded through with nationalistic Christian theology, and evil is the right word when a leader uses religion to justify, in God's name, invasion, violence, and annihilation. Thank you, Tim Costello. Yes. And it is disturbing to see Christian apologists for Putin. Deep misunderstanding. Deep mistake. A couple more things about this. So Putin's crude language. Have you heard some of the things he said? CNN wrote about his coarse remarks about Ukraine, and this gives you another insight into how he thinks about his role and Ukraine. When he was talking about the Minsk agreements, those are the agreements that govern. It's a ceasefire protocol signed by Ukraine and Russia in 2015, related to some of the previously contested parts of eastern Ukraine. Putin said, "As for the Minsk agreements, are they alive and do they have any prospect or not?" Putin said, "I believe that there is simply no other alternative. I repeat, once again, in Kiev, they either say that they will comply or they say that this will destroy their country." The incumbent president recently stated that he does not like a single point of these agreements. Like it or don't like it, it's your duty, my beauty. They must be fulfilled. It won't work otherwise. Of course, there are some things we can't argue about with the president of the Russian Federation, Zelensky said. Ukraine is a beauty. As far as my is concerned, that's a slight overstatement. Regarding the line about being dutiful and taking it, Zelensky added, "I think Ukraine is very patient because that's wisdom. I think that's important not just for Ukraine, but for all of Europe." It's not the first time Putin has used such language. One of his most famous quotes dates back to 1999 when he was still prime minister, when he vowed to crush Chechen separatists, saying, "If they are on the toilet, we will waste them on the outhouse." So why does Putin use the language of marital rape when he's talking about Ukraine? Like it or don't like it, it's your duty, my beauty. This guy. And then his church backs him. From the Jerusalem Post, Putin successfully won re-election, and Kirill's ideology has been linked to Putin ever since. This was back when Putin was running again, and the head of the Orthodox Church, Kirill, helped campaign, helped the church, helped align political efforts in the church to back Putin, and those two have been aligned ever since. Back to the Jerusalem Post article, Russia's annexation of Crimea and the eruption of conflict in the Donbas in 2014 also had an enormous impact on the Russian Orthodox Church. Ukraine's Orthodox churches remained under the Moscow Patriarchate's authority after the collapse of the Soviet Union, indeed about 30% of the Russian Orthodox Church's parishes were actually in Ukraine. The conflict in Crimea and eastern Ukraine, however, intensified Ukrainians' calls for an independent Orthodox Church. Patriarch Bartholomew, the spiritual head of Orthodox Christianity, granted that independence in 2019. Moscow not only refused to recognize the new church, but also severed relations with Constantinople, threatening a broader schism. Orthodox Christians in Ukraine were divided over which church to follow, deepening Russia's cultural anxieties about losing Ukraine to the West. So that's the deal, is Putin is worried about losing Ukraine to the West. And he's worried about it on a couple different levels. One is the values thing. He's the Russian Orthodox Church and him are very tied together. He's passionate in creating Russia as a super state that can bring about this powerful moral force to counter the godless West, in his view. And he's got the whole Russian Orthodox Church apparatus backing him up. It's a pretty wild combination of forces, especially if you're used to the Western way of doing things. But the getting back to and just kind of winding down here, I want to talk a little bit about the importance of who we surround ourselves with and who we are listening to. Because as I know I've talked a lot about Putin on this show today, and I think it's important that we understand the forces at play, what's going on and why, and what can we learn from it. So Putin's surrounded by people who won't tell him the truth. He doesn't see what's real. Now, he may see the news articles from the West. I'm sure he has access to all of the internet sites that he's blocked his people from seeing. I'm sure he can read and see what people are saying, but he doesn't see and perceive the truth. Or if he does, he twists it into a lie. Why is that? Well, he's surrounded himself with people who, yes men, right? And I had to think about that. It's like, do I surround myself with people who point me towards truth? Sometimes it's irritating when my kids or my wife point me towards truth. This has happened numerous times. We spent a lot of time together over spring break, and it was awesome. And I love that my kids are all independent and strong enough to call me out when I need to be called out. And it's a reminder that, you know what? I may be the good king in some way, but the part of the deal about being a good king is that you allow people to speak the truth to you when you need to be spoken the truth to. If you are being an unwise king, or if you're making a bad decision, to have somebody be able to feel safe in coming to you and going, hey, I don't think this is right. And for you to really hear that without feeling threatened or taking retribution, that's critical. It's huge. So I was challenged to not react harshly when faced with criticism or critique. The other night, we were playing a game as a family, and I am so bad at games for some reason. I'm just not, card games, board games, you name it. There's a joke around my family. It's like, I'll play because I want to hang out with the kids and the family and spend time together, but I'm just not great at it. And because I'm not great at it, it's not my favorite thing in the world to do. And the other night, I was losing fairly poorly. And one of my kids called me out on it. And at first, I was like, that just added to the insult. Not only am I losing, but my kid is calling me out on my poor losing. But I thought, you know what? He's actually exactly right. And I went back to him the next day, and I apologized for the way I talked to him, because I actually needed to. And that night at dinner, I apologized to the family because I had been out of line. And that is what the good king does. I think it was the Egyptians who, for a season, I have to go look this up again. I think Jordan Peterson talked about this, but their emperor, there was some routine. Somebody help me out with this. Drop it in the comments. I'll look it up. I'll see if I can look it up and get the details for you later. But there was a routine where annually they would take him outside the city and they would tell him in the ways in which he had been a bad emperor, the ways in which he had not been a good king. They gave him critical feedback. And we need that. Guys like Putin could stay connected to reality if they had a little humility and a little critical feedback. But they won't have any of that. Too insecure, too power hungry, it just kills them. So I guess our lesson today, my learning from the past couple of weeks, is to pay attention to the things and pay attention to the good, like the true good and beautiful, because that can shift our perspective. That changes the way we see patterns in the world. If you really let yourself sit with something beautiful, whether that's sitting in front of a piece of art at a museum, or whether that's dropping into a conversation with your wife on a date night about something that you've really needed to talk about, or whether it's just laying outside under a beautiful sky and just looking at the clouds. That can be beautiful too. Things that create awe, a sense of our own smallness, a sense of God's bigness. For me, sitting in that living room in New York, watching those kids pray for each other, watching them be moved to tears, watching the Spirit of God move in that room for 4.5 hours, that's the kind of beauty that shifts my perspective and helps me see things in a new light. Even ugly stories like the story about Putin can point us towards wisdom. But we have to allow it to point us towards wisdom. We have to be able to see through the fear. Remember what we talked about the other week? How perfect love casts out fear? It's like oil and water. You can't have them both in the same place. Thank you, friends, for spending this hour with me. I hope you have a wonderful week, and I can't wait to rejoin you